Pokemon is known for the generation mechanics these days. These are the single new feature of battling that's defined each generation from the others for its very own distinct format. And while every set of games since Generation 5 has had a new mechanic, it's not to say these are the only ways we've changed competitive. Generation 4 did have the physical special split, Generation 3 added in abilities, and even Generation 6, despite adding in Megas, also had the introduction of the new Fairy typing. But that's not what we're talking about today. Today we're going to discuss the things that have come in one generation and left by the next. So if you enjoy this type of VGC content, or just VGC content in general, consider subscribing, as every week I have content just like this. Also, let me know down below what your favorite generation mechanic is, and also consider hitting the join button if you want to go that extra mile. For just a couple dollars a month, it supports all the work we do on the channel, and you get some nice emotes and badges while you're at it to show you're a supporter. With that all out of the way, let's start off with Unova, where we had the very first time we had a generation gimmick. A lot of people dismiss the Generation 5 games for even having a gimmick, but these actually did have their very own gimmick to them, that a lot of people wouldn't have really classified back then, but it technically does count. In this case, we're talking about the predecessor of Z crystals, being the gems, which were a very influential part of Generation 5 VGC. Gems were an extremely powerful option for competitive that really changed the way that the landscape went, as it gave you a single use 1.5 times boost to any type you wanted as long as you had a move of the matching gem. For example, if I used Draco Meteor on a Latios and I held the Dragon Gem item, the first time I used this move and landed, I would get a really powerful base 195 Draco Meteor that comes right before we get all the stab boosts and any other super effective boosts. This was a really easy way to get essentially what would be a choice specs or choice band equivalent without having to commit to any specific move. You could just get that one-time one-off nuke option that would KO most Pokemon. Now in doubles, this was best used on Dragon types due to the lack of a Fairy type at this generation, so Pokemon like Latios and Hydreigon were very high mainstays with this, though there were a lot of other good offensive threats such as Volcarona, Thundurus, and Metagross that would use these gems to high success. There were also cases of support Pokemon even using this, with options like Hitmontop also using the fighting gem and getting a lot of success at Worlds. Since gems could activate on multiple Pokemon in the same match on the same team, there were players that ended up running multiple of these, such as Henry Maxon, who got top 4 at the 2012 Worlds for the senior division, who ended up using gems on 4 of his 6 Pokemon. Now gems were definitely a strong way to show off generation mechanics in VGC, but unfortunately a lot of the terror that the gems caused in VGC was lost to time due to the fact that these events did not have very much documentation to them. But we do have some mechanics later on that were very terrifying that we have a lot of documentation for. One mechanic that a lot of players definitely centralized around for VGC was the introduction of Megas. Mega Evolution truly did redefine competitive Pokemon in a lot of ways that have carried over for several generations. For starters, this was the first time of many instances in VGC where players would essentially have that team captain sort of role. We've also seen this carry over into formats such as Sword and Shield with the Gigantamax and Dynamax Pokemon, or even in Scarlet and Violet with the Regulation G format where you only had one restricted. But this was probably the very first instance of a true team captain sort of role. While this wasn't as prominent in Generation 7 due to the fact that power creep got a lot higher, in Generation 6 this was definitely the big deal because there was very low power level of a lot of these formats, especially during X and Y. While X and Y definitely still had a lot of potent options such as Garchomp and Hydreigon, and Oras still had options like Landorus Stand and Thundurus Incarnate, most of these Mega Evolutions would be your team's star player in a lot of games. The Mega Evolution era of Pokemon has a lot of different chapters to it, but starting off with X and Y, there was only a couple Megas you would probably be centralizing around. Essentially, most teams fell onto one of Mega Kangaskhan, Charizard Y, or Mega Mawile for their team's Mega spot. Though there were actually a lot of good niche Megas at the time that still did see some play, such as Mega Gyarados, which ended up winning Worlds. We also had Mega Tyranitar and Venusaur, which were both very good bulky second Megas on your team, or even Mega Manectric, which is a really good fast Intimidate pivot. But if your team wasn't carrying at least one of Kang, Mawile, or Zard Y, you were probably at a bit of a disadvantage here. Now, Oras changed the game vastly for what Megas truly were worth utilizing though. With the introduction of several new Megas into the format, as well as an expanded pool of usable Pokemon and moves, a lot of players ended up changing what Megas they used from X and Y as opposed to Oras. One of the newest Pokemon to gain a Mega was Salamence, and it was a very quick top tier threat. Mega Mawile did fall out of favor from this big three, and instead Salamence joined the fray, as well as a new introduction of Mega Gardevoir. Now Mega Gardevoir was a really big deal, since even though it wasn't a Mega created in Oras, it gained a new move in the game through the introduction of Hyper Voice, which in tandem with Pixelate would grant it a very strong Fairy Stab that it could take advantage of to harm both opponents. While Gardevoir could technically learn this move if you transferred it from an older game, because VGC at the time only allowed moves you could obtain within X and Y, it wasn't something that was actually usable in doubles, so despite Mega Gardevoir still being a prominent option in X and Y singles because of this move, it really wasn't seen in VGC. But with Hyper Voice in Oras though, Mega Gardevoir was actually a really big main staple on a lot of these different balance archetypes. While these 4 megas were all very powerful options to watch out for, there was definitely some other niche options, albeit less than there were in X and Y. And when the restricted format came up, this pool definitely thinned out even more, as the format definitely centralized around Rayquaza, Gengar, and Kangaskhan. And if your team didn't have at least one of these 3, it was probably going to be a mid team at best. At the very least, in 2016, there were a few other niche megas such as Salamence and Gyarados, which pre-mega had Intimidate, Mega Manectric, which post-mega had Intimidate, or Venusaur, which was at least a good bulky option for Primal Kyogre, to name a few. But they were definitely a lot worse when compared to the 2016 metagame's top 3 picks. This mostly came to the fact that Primal Kyogre and Groudon, which were essentially mega adjacent Pokemon, were so dominant at the time that it ruined a lot of different Pokemon. Without weather being as prominent due to the fact that the primal weather just overtook it, options like Zard-Y fell really quickly out of favor, and because Xerneas was also legal, Mega Gardevoir did too. Now Megas did come back for one more set of games, being in VGC 2018 and 2019 during the Ultra Sun and Moon era. This changed even more how Mega Evolution acted, as when you Mega Evolved, you now instantly gained a speed boost instead of having to wait a whole turn. While there were some other really good picks like Salamence, Gengar, Charizard-Y, and Tyranitar that were all very relevant, Metagross definitely was the best, but this had the most noteworthy options we ever had. There were even some other niche threats like Mega Kangaskhan, Mega Mawile, and Mega Blaziken actually, which found a lot of success when ran next to Bisharp. 2019 had the same issue that 2016 had, where really only Rayquaza and Gengar actually saw play, though Mega Salamence did overtake Kangaskhan's placement this time as a really good Mega, and it even partnered well next to Pokemon like Primal Groudon. This time at Worlds though, Rayquaza wasn't the Mon that ended up winning, it was actually Mega Salamence, which was really funny because in both Generation 7 games, the games where Megas were the backseat, we actually saw success from Mega Salamence, which was a very good nightmare in the ORAS format. Now Generation 7 definitely wasn't meant to be built around Megas, but it did have one other mechanic being Z-moves, which were a lot more potent at the time and still very important to talk about. Now Z-moves were another mechanic that had a lot of presence in VGC. These were essentially the sequel to Gems, and they were a lot better balanced than the Gems were, since you really could only activate one per game. These were still very high base power attacks though, that you could essentially choose when they would activate in return for only getting to use one per match, which was at least a nice way to attempt to balance them. Now Z-moves do have a couple other benefits, such as they have some niche effects for status moves, though this was often overlooked, though it did see some success on occasional picks like Ghost Z-move on Mimikyu going for Destiny Bond as a nice option to add Follow Me to it, but overall it was a very niche thing nonetheless. Z-moves did have one other strong benefit over Gems though, which is that you could get a small amount of damage through Protect, as this would get you a 1/4 amount of damage, so you at least still can't fully protect from these. This meant that you can get some very last second KOs on Pokemon just by activating your Z-move and clear the field a little bit quicker, though this is nothing like what we'd see in Sword and Shield with Urshifu that just completely bypasses Protect. Now there were a lot of reasons to use Z-Crystals in VGC for Generation 7, but they were ultimately, just like with the Gems, used on a lot of good offensive win cons, such as Tapu Koko and Garchomp in 2017, Landorus, Therian, and Kartana in 2018, and in 2019, 2 of the best users were probably Tapu Koko and Sakataka. While you wouldn't exactly see teams that ran like 4 Z-Crystals compared to how Gems did, you would still find players that ran about 1 or 2 per team, and it wasn't exactly uncommon to find multiple Z-moves on a team still, similar to how players would sometimes run a second Mega. The biggest issue with Z-moves honestly was just the fact that they got overshadowed by Mega still, and that the 2 in tandem were a lot for a team to prep for, because you had to prep for a Mega Evolution, a Z-Crystal, and still 4 other Pokemon that could end up being things like a second Mega Evolution, a second Z-Crystal user, potentially a Primal if we were in 2019, and many other things. So the team just got very overwhelming very quickly, and thankfully these mechanics ended up sticking and ending in Ultra Sun and Moon. Now Generation 8 gave us the introduction of Dynamax and Gigantamax options, which were a whole different can of worms. This is probably the most divisive mechanic we've ever had, and it was essentially like the Mega Evolution Team Captain issue, but on steroids. Instead of just having this activate for only one of 48 different Pokemon potentially that were required to hold an item, you could just Dynamax any Pokemon in the game. Depending on who you asked, some people would say this was the greatest mechanic we had, and it offered a lot of different versatility to VGC, while other players would probably say that they wish this mechanic never happened and that Generation 8 was ruined because of it. Now, when you did pick your Pokemon with Dynamax or Gigantamax, you got a few different benefits, such as an HP stat that would go up for just 2 times for the whole 3-turn period. You would also get moves that would deal a lot more base power, and you could get up to 3 turns of them. Or even if you just ran any sort of status move, you could get it to turn into Protect temporarily, granting you a permanent way to bypass the max guard, as all of these Dynamax moves that were offensively speaking could all break through normal Protect. Speaking of these offensive moves on Dynamax Pokemon, they all had their own different effects. There were 10 different max moves that affected your stats, as well as options like Max Flare that could set Sun, or Max Lightning that could end up going for electric terrain. and this made terrain and weather very volatile in Generation 8. Meanwhile, some of the stat boosting options like Max Airstream that increased your speed, or Max Knuckle that did your attack were very potent to get your team snowballing stat boosts very quickly. Or on the flip side, you could use options like Max Darkness to drop your opponent's special defense stat, and Max Flutterby to lower your opponent's physical attack. So there was a lot of ways that your Dynamax Pokemon really could set the field in just 3 turns. This meant that unlike with Mega Evolution, there was a lot more of a time-sensitive requirement to it, meaning that options like Haze Dusclops or Clear Smog Gastrodon could just come in if you time your Dynamax wrong and clear any stat boost you made for the whole game. This doesn't even get into how disruptive some of the Gigantamax Pokemon were though, as these G-Max Pokemon were very terrifying. Now these were limited to about 20 different Pokemon, but these 20 or so picks were still very noteworthy. A lot of the early forms that did end up getting some play but didn't really carry over too much include picks like Butterfree, Snorlax, Lapras, Hatterene, and Pikachu to name a few. But there were 4 that in my eyes stood out as far more broken than the rest. These include the Kanto starters of Venusaur, Blastoise, and Charizard, as well as Colossal, which all had a stab max move for the Fire, Water, Grass typing, or in Colossus' case Rock typing, that could deal 1/6 damage to both opponents over time. The one exception was if your opponent had a Pokemon on the field that completely matched the type. And while grass types such as Rillaboom and Venusaur were very common getting around the Vine Lash that Venusaur would set with his G-Max form, there wasn't exactly a lot of Rock types being run in VGC outside of the occasional Stack Attacker or Nihilego. So Gigantamax Colossal's max move was very potent, as was Charizard's, which really only had Incineroar as a common immunity outside of Charizard itself. If your opponent never switched in a Pokemon that was completely immune to the move, they would essentially take 1/3 of their entire team's health, whether it was on 2 different Pokemon that took all 3 turns, or it was on 4 different Pokemon that ended up switching in and out. You would lose 1/3 of your team's entire pool of HP, which is incredible to say the least from one single move. Because you can't even successfully protect around this outside of the use of Max Guard, this was very noteworthy and very destructive. There were still some other picks that saw play in later formats such as Rillaboom and Cinderace, or the Urshifus that could be used as the only way to break Max Guard with their Max Signature move. While I think this mechanic had a lot going for it, I think that Dynamax and Gems were definitely 2 of the most unpopular mechanics, and they were definitely 2 of the least balanced, and I think going forward it at least helped a lot with the game health that this is no longer a thing. From a VGC perspective at least, I do quite like our last mechanic a lot, and I would argue it's the most balanced mechanic we've ever had. Terastallization takes a lot of what worked in our previous mechanics, such as the fact that you could only use it once per game from options like Z-Moves and Dynamax, and also the fact that it did last for multiple turns, like things like Megas did, and it really just gave a lot to balance the game in my opinion. If you were to Terastallize a Pokemon, you do change its type for the whole rest of the game while it is on the field, and it does change your typing to either give you a 1.5 boost for a new type altogether, or if you change it to the type of one of your 2 previous typings, you would gain a 2 times boost instead of the normal 1.5 stab. This meant if, for example, I went for Terra Normal on Hisui Arcanine, I would get a 1.5 boost for my normal type attacks. But if I go for Terra Rock, my Rock typing moves would all gain a 2 times stab boost instead of the normal boost, making them significantly more powerful. While Terra definitely did assist a lot of good defensive picks like Heatran, Hisui Arcanine, and Amoonguss to name a few that didn't necessarily love their typings for the entire game but could use the new typing to get much better defensive benefits, there were a lot of other offensive picks that managed to benefit really well. These were things such as Chien-Pao going for a Ghost or Stellar typing, Fluttermane going for typings like Fairy, Grass, Water, and many others, or the Urshifus going for their Stab, Dark, and Water typings depending on the form. Generation 9 also did introduce plenty of other options such as Dragonite, which ended up being the best it's ever been in VGC, going for Terra Normal or Flying sets, or even both Raging Bolt and Fluttermane taking advantage of Terra to overtake Incineroar in terms of potency. This also isn't even to mention that because of Terra, Rillaboom has honestly been the best starter in VGC, and it's probably the best Pokemon as of the current format. And it's not even close because Incineroar definitely has in comparison fallen off. There's even a couple picks that got some Terra exclusive forms, such as the Ogerpons, which you could use as the only Pokemon to gain a 1 stat boost for their Terra through the ability Embody Aspect, or Terapagos, which gets just a whole different stat line altogether when you go for Terra. Speaking of Terapagos, with the introduction of this Pokemon, we gain a new typing as well through the Stellar typing, which essentially grants any users a 2 times boost for any of the previous stabs they'd have, or 1.2 times boost to any non-stab they had, and this worked for all 4 of your moves. The only issue is that this boost only lasts for 1 time per attack, and unless you're Terapagos, it goes away after you use the 1 move of that typing. While I expect in future formats we'll see a lot more restricted Pokemon such as Terapagos, Calyrexes, and Miraidon all becoming terrifying monstrosities again, we'll have to also wait and see to find out what new box arts end up taking the stage if we do get a second restricted spot, as there are a lot of picks that I think could end up taking the crown this year. Overall, if I had to say what the most balanced mechanic was, I would probably say it was Terra, with the least balanced probably being either Gems or Dynamax. But let me know what you guys think down below, as I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. While you're on your way down there, consider hitting the like button if you enjoyed and subscribing for more. If you made it this far, I assume it's because you enjoyed the content, and if you are interested, I have a whole backlog of other videos that you guys will probably find interesting as well. And if you want to go even further for your support on the channel, consider hitting the join button. For just a couple dollars a month, you get some nice emotes and a badge next to your name, and you can join other current members such as Zeke Zero and Josh Gilder Player, who go the extra long way of supporting the channel. Finally, if you guys enjoyed the videos today, check out our editors. We have Dose, who edited today's video, as well as Becca, who edits a lot of our short form content, as well as our Thursday videos. Both their links will be down below, and I highly recommend you check them both out. With that said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, peace out, guys.